Good afternoon. My name is Mark Hansen, and I'm Interim Director of the Practical Ethics Center here on campus. This is the final installment for our spring series, so thank you all for coming. And look out for announcements of our fall series later on. So today we are really privileged to have with us Deborah Slicer, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy here at the university. Her research and teaching interests include environmental ethics as well as philosophy and literature. She co-directed the Women's Studies program during the first year here in the mid-1990s, and she, along with Josh Slotnick, started the university's Peace program in 1997. She wants us to know she just adopted a horse named Doc, and Deborah and Doc are both long-term vegetarians. She's here to talk to us today about moral vegetarianism. Thanks, Deborah.
Thanks. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Colleen, and thank you all for being here. It's so pretty outside. I won't keep you too long. And I guess you all brought your peanut butter and tofu sandwiches with you, right, for lunch? Actually, I'm going to be talking from a paper that I wrote several years ago for an anthology by Carol Adams, and spent Hawaii on this great vacation I'd given myself, and then finished it, sent it to her, and a few months later she decided not to do the anthology. So it's been, and then I did nothing else with the paper, so this has given me a good opportunity to get it back out and reread it and revise it and maybe get your comments on parts of it, and then maybe get it back out there again here this summer. So I'm grateful for that opportunity. I've distributed a handout. The first side should help you just follow the main points of the talk, and on the flip side there are quotes from several sources that I'm going to be referring to, so you'll be able to read these along with me. There are a few I didn't Xerox that are in the paper, but they're short. And
I don't think your mic is working.
Can you not hear me?
Could you speak a little louder?
Yeah, I'll speak louder. Thanks for telling me that. It's not amplifying. I guess it's he's recording this for MCAT. But if you can't hear me, yeah, I will speak louder. So I'll just get going on the working from the handout, part one. There are a number of arguments for vegetarianism, and actually I should make a distinction, I guess, between vegetarianism and veganism. I'm actually a vegan, and so is Doc, but the vegetarian doesn't eat animal flesh, as you probably know, but the vegan doesn't eat any animal products at all, including eggs or milk or any other dairy products. So this is sort of an argument for moral veganism, and there are a number of popular arguments, many of which you've heard, I'm sure, for vegetarianism and ultimately for veganism. There's the environmental argument, and there are lots of parts to that argument, including concerns about sewage from large industrial farms that pollute rivers and pollute other bay areas. This is a real problem where I come from in Virginia along the Chesapeake Bay and further south. So sewage from large industrial farms that pollute waterways. There are concerns about cattle that graze on leased public lands that deprive native species of habitat and degrade native environments of native plants, and degrade riparian areas on those public leased lands. So those are just a couple of the environmental concerns couched in the environmental argument. There are health arguments. I became a vegetarian initially for health reasons. I do consider this a moral argument, by the way, because I think there are moral imperatives to to honor and take good care of our bodies. Vegetarianism, I think, is one way of doing that. The health arguments include reduced fat vegetarian diets, reduced cholesterol vegetarian diets. If you're eating a vegetarian diet, then you're not consuming antibiotics and hormones that you are ingesting if you're eating at least industrialized farmed animals. It's not so true if you're buying animals that are raised locally, say from Lifeline Farms. And there's the world hunger argument, arguments to the effect that eating animals is an inefficient way to get protein. For example, feeding 6 pounds of grain to a pig in order to get 1 pound of usable protein is an inefficient way to feed people, that we could feed very many more hungry people if we were distributing that grain directly to the hungry. I don't know, well, anyway, I have some reservations about that argument. I think there's probably already enough available protein for the hungry. They're not getting it for political reasons, but not so much because people are eating meat. And then there's the last argument. I'm calling it for short the animal rights argument. This is the argument that we should be vegetarians for the animal's sake, basically. That non-human animals, including the ones we eat, have moral worth, and that we have moral duties not to cause avoidable harm to them. Okay, so they have moral worth, and we have moral duties to refrain from causing avoidable harm to them. And I'm going to focus on this one, that last argument, the animal rights argument. The two best known arguments for vegetarianism for the animal's sake are Peter Singer's argument and Tom Reagan's argument. You might be familiar with these. Singer is a utilitarian. The utilitarian argues we should always minimize suffering and maximize pleasure for all sentient life, that is, for all who are capable of experiencing suffering and pleasure. So we should minimize suffering, maximize pleasure for all sentient life. And his argument essentially is that vegetarianism minimizes suffering in the moral universe. Vegetarianism minimizes suffering. Tom Reagan's argument is a little bit different. He argues that all who have conscious interest in their own well-being have rights not to be harmed. So all who have conscious interest in their own well-being have rights not to be harmed. And he includes animals among those who have conscious interest in their own well-being. And so animals have rights not to be harmed, he argues. Now, these arguments seem right to me. I wouldn't argue with them. I bet you wouldn't either, that it's important to minimize suffering in the world and to maximize pleasure in the moral universe, and that those who have conscious interest ought not to be harmed when we can avoid harming those who have conscious interest. Those are more or less moral givens, I think. So there's nothing really wrong with these arguments, and I have a lot of respect for both Singer and Reagan as philosophers and as activists. But for me, these arguments they've always seemed incomplete, and they don't fully resonate with my own moral reasons for being a vegan. And I've been trying for about 15 years to become more and more articulate about why I made this choice about 20 years ago to be a vegetarian and later a vegan. I'm still trying. And as I said, Singer and Reagan's arguments don't fully capture it for me. So I've come to recognize that what I'm going to be calling love in this paper has something to do with my choice to be a moral vegan. And I want to focus on that concept, love. When I use that term, I'm not talking about erotic love, and I'm not talking about romantic love. I'm not talking about some kind of sentimental love. I'm using it in a fairly specific way. And I'll talk about that in just a second. In the rest of what I'm going to say, I'm going to be talking about two moral ideals. One has to do with love. The other has to do with this issue of avoidable harm. So let me say something about avoidable harm first. And I'm on number 4 on the handout now, in case you'd like to keep up. Two moral ideals that I want to be speaking to in what's in the following. The first one I think is fairly obvious. We should not cause avoidable harm. Okay? Again, it's another one of those moral givens, I think. If you're playing the moral game, this is one of the rules. It's one of the basic rules. You should not cause avoidable harm. This is what a philosopher named Stephen Clark has to say about that. He wrote a book in 77, it's been a while, called The Moral Status of Animals. And it's an unfortunately neglected book by a very eloquent, I think, philosopher. It's written for non-philosophers as well as for philosophers. I highly recommend it. Here's what he says, though. He says, whatever be true, whether there be God or only atoms, whether men are significantly superior to non-human animals or no, whether there be a life to come or this poor accident be all, this at least cannot be true, that it is proper to be the cause of avoidable ill. There may be other moral principles than this, but this at least is dogma. That it is never proper to be the cause of avoidable ill. So that's one principle that I think is relevant to the moral vegetarian case. The second principle has to do with love. And again, I'm on number 4. And it's more of an Aristotelian sentiment than anything. It has 2 parts. Aristotle, as well as Clark and some others, say that over the course of our lives, we should aim to fulfill our best capacities as human animals. So over the course of our lives, we should aim to fulfill our best capacities as human animals. And one such capacity is this capacity to love, in the sense that I'm going to be using that term. Again, I'm not referring to sentimental love or romantic love or erotic love necessarily. So what do I mean by love? Number 5. Love includes being empathetic and also paying what some philosophers call moral attention to others and to the details of moral situations, moral context. So they sort of use these terms synonymously: love, moral attention, perception. Aristotle called it roughly practical wisdom. And I want to talk a little bit more about this concept. If you'll turn to the flip side of the handout, I'll read you something from Marilyn Frye, who's a contemporary moral and feminist philosopher, who wrote, this is in the left-hand side of the page, in an essay entitled In and Out of Harm's Way, Arrogance and Love, feminist philosopher Marilyn Frye distinguishes between arrogant and loving perception. And here's what she has to say. The loving eye is a contrary of the arrogant eye. The loving eye knows the independence of the other. It is the eye of a seer who knows that nature is indifferent. It is the eye of one who knows that to know the seen, one must consult something other than one's own will and interest and fears and imagination. One must look at the thing. One must look and listen and check and question. The loving eye is one that pays a certain sort of attention. This attention can require a discipline, but not self-denial. The discipline is one of self-knowledge, knowledge of the scope and boundary of the self. In particular, it is a matter of being able to tell one's own interest from those of others, and of knowing where one's self leaves off and another begins. That's a really hard thing, and that's what I think we mean by empathy. The loving eye does not make the object of perception into something edible. She's using that term metaphorically here. She's not talking so much about vegetarianism in this essay, but I think we could use it literally. Does not try to assimilate it, does not reduce it to the size of the seer's desire, fear, and imagination, and hence does not have to simplify. The loving eye knows the complexity of the other as something which will forever present new things to be known. The science of the loving eye would favor the complexity theory of truth in contrast to the simplicity theory of truth, and presuppose the endless interestingness of the universe. I really love that idea. That's the idea of the difference between loving and arrogance. And I think you all have probably had experiences with this. I talk to my students about this when we read this essay by Marilyn Frye. You know how in a relationship, how really wonderful it feels when someone you feel is appreciating you for who you are and is really listening to you and is really honoring not only the things you have in common but your differences. That's what she means by loving. And you know how bad it feels in relationship when someone utterly, or even to some degree, assimilates you into their own desires, their interest, their fears, their fantasies, and you get lost. That's arrogance. Okay. So I think this difference between arrogance and love is important, and it's also an important moral skill, loving. Paying loving attention to an other, paying loving attention to the world. The other person who's written quite a lot about love in this sense, or moral attention, is Martha Nussbaum, and she's actually lifted the concept from Henry James, the novelist. And I have 3 passages here from Nussbaum's book, Love's Knowledge. The first one, I guess, yeah, it's well, the one in the middle, it's the first Nussbaum passage I'll read from real quickly here. Moral knowledge, William James suggests, is not simply intellectual grasp of propositions. It is not even simply intellectual grasp of particular facts. It is perception. And that's their word for what we're calling love. It is seeing a complex, concrete reality in a highly lucid and richly responsive way. It is taking in what is there with imagination and feeling. And then in the next section, the effort really to see and really to represent is no idle business in face of the constant force that makes for muddlement. So Henry James on the task of a moral imagination. We live amid bewildering complexities. Obtuseness and refusal of vision are our besetting vices. They're talking about arrogance here. Responsible lucidity can be wrested from that darkness only by painful, vigilant effort, the intense scrutiny of particulars. Our highest and hardest task as human beings is to make ourselves people on whom nothing is lost. To make ourselves people on whom nothing is lost. And then finally, in that last quote from Nussbaum, as she's talking again about perception or love or attention, we can develop here the analogy with our sensory powers that the term perception already suggests. In seeing and hearing, we are, I believe, seeing not that the world as it is in its itself apart from human beings and human conceptual schemes, but a world already interpreted and humanized by our faculties and our concepts. That's some philosophers. Mumbo jumbo. And yet, who would deny that there are some among us whose visual or auditory acuity is greater than that of others? Some who have developed their faculties more finely, who can make discriminations of color and shape, of pitch and timbre, that are unavailable to the rest of us, who miss less, therefore, of what is to be heard or seen in a landscape, a symphony, or a painting. Jamesian moral perception, I think, is like this: a fine development of our human capacities to see and feel and judge, an ability to miss less, to be morally responsive to more. Okay. So I'm hoping now that you have a better sense of what I'm talking about when I talk about love, and I'm contrasting it with arrogance. Arrogance is that assimilating the other or a situation into your own fantasy. Love is being attentive to what's really out there in the form or the being, the life of an other, and the context of another. Now, the goal of moral attention or love is to appreciate, among other things, another's point of view, to recognize where I leave off and another begins. And being able to do this is the basis, I think, for practicing other moral virtues and other moral values like compassion, trust, friendship, respect, and justice, ultimately. So it's being able to do this sort of basic moral activity. And it takes practice, as Aristotle and Nussbaum and Henry James acknowledge. Loving, it's being able to do that, recognize where you leave off and another begins. Okay. Being, refraining from assimilating others into your fantasy. It's being able to do that that's a prerequisite, I think, for practicing all of these other moral skills and honoring all of these other moral values, like compassion. You can't be really compassionate towards someone, can you? Really and appropriately compassionate towards someone, unless you are able to love that person in the sense, or animal, in the sense of love that I'm using. Being able to appreciate their reality, what they're going through. Only then can you be appropriately compassionate, or be a good friend, or earn their trust. Okay, so what's all this got to do with animals and vegetarianism? I'll go there now. There's no doubt in my mind that non-human animals, including the ones that we eat, can be subjects of our moral attention or love. That is, there's no doubt in my mind that they have a point of view that includes fear and joys and desires, the ability to be harmed and benefited as they try and live a life of their kind. And I'm not going to argue this. I just hope it's apparent to people. I grew up with farm animals. Actually, my grandparents had a dairy farm, and I lived on it until I was 8, and then spent summers there. And this is just so obvious to me, I couldn't argue it with someone, and I would just say that if someone doubts that other animals, including the ones that we eat, have a point of view, then they haven't spent enough time with chickens or cows or lambs or pigs. I would also argue that the harm we do to the animals that we eat is avoidable in industrialized countries where there are affordable and abundant alternatives to eating them. Okay. So I think, if to relate this back to love or moral attention, that when one attends to lovingly the viewpoint or the reality of the animals that we tend to slaughter and consume, one can't help but recognize that they have a point of view. As I put it a minute ago, fears, desires, joys, the ability to be harmed or benefited, and that harming them is to them in industrialized countries where there are affordable and abundant alternatives. And I think somehow this is a sort of, it's an important sort of psychological starting place, and it's loving, that people who it seems to me often do eat animals are, and I've seen this and I've experienced this in myself, have these sort of moral blind spots where their moral attention just doesn't, or the loving, in the way I've been using loving, doesn't extend itself. It isn't practiced with non-human animals, and so they miss a lot. And the importance of loving as a prerequisite for being ultimately compassionate and just is something that's left out of the Singer-Reagan picture. So why should we cultivate this moral capacity, this capacity to love, and why should we practice it? Well, I think there are two reasons why we should cultivate this moral capacity, loving, and why we should practice it. The first one is, and they're both Aristotelian reasons, actually. The first one is this: I think that as individuals we're diminished as human animals when we don't fulfill our potential to love. I think we're diminished as human animals when we don't fulfill our potential to love in that moral sense of paying attention. And I think as communities, we're richer in proportion to the attention we pay to others, including animals. So we're richer in proportion to the attention we pay to the realities of others, and we're richer in proportion to the minimal harm that we do. And there's a great quote that's related to this anyway by Henry Beston, who was I think a self-taught naturalist and nature writer. It's on the back side of the handout that I gave you. And he's writing here about community, and he's using the term community in a fairly broad sense to include not only human-human relationships, but human non-human relationships. And he's talking about the richness or the potential richness of those human non-human relationships that we forge through loving or paying attention to them. Remote from universal nature and living by complicated artifice, man in civilization surveys the creature through the glass of his knowledge. He's talking about arrogance here, and sees thereby a feather magnified and the whole image in distortion. We patronize them for their incompleteness, for their tragic fate of having taken form so far below ourselves. And therein we err, and we err greatly. For the animal shall not be measured by man. In a world older and more complete than ours, they move finished and complete, gifted with extensions of the senses we have lost or never attained, living by voices we shall never hear. They are not brethren, and they are not underlings. They are other nations, caught with ourselves in the net of life and time, fellow prisoners of the splendor and travail of the earth. I like that last line in particular. They are not brethren, and they are not underlings. They are other nations, the animal nations, caught with ourselves in the net of life and time, fellow prisoners of the splendor and of the travail of life on earth. So, that's sort of the end of the case I was making for love and what love had to do with it. I was maybe going to read just a little bit from this paper that I pulled out of the closet, just as an example, to give you a couple of examples, more examples of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about love, and when I talk about how it seems to me love is makes our communities richer, and it makes our lives as human animals richer. So I'll read one of these, maybe two, but when I was 6 years old, my uncle put 24 chickens in cages and brought them screaming to the milk house for slaughter. He sharpened his axe, brought in a large wooden chopping block, boiled water in large kettles for dunking their decapitated bodies. Have some of you witnessed or participated in this? I used to be an ace chicken killer along with my uncle. That was one of my jobs, or our jobs on the farm. And then we got to work. The whole affair from caging to plucking took a long afternoon and evening. I watched. Later on, I helped. I remember best the hot steam from the kettles of boiling water, the smell of blood and the humidity, his efficiency and his impatience with the chickens who fought back. He brought the same sort of efficiency to that killing that he brought to tuning the tractor engine. And his impatience with the fighting chickens was similar to his impatience with the tractor when it stalled in the field. This was the same man who felt tremendous guilt and grief over a dog's death after he accidentally backed a hay truck over the dog who was sleeping under the back wheels. My uncle couldn't bear to hear that story told without openly weeping. The woman promoting vegetarianism in this essay was also the girl who watched without, as far as I can remember, the least bit of empathetic sympathy, the decapitation and dismemberment of those dozen chickens when she was 6. If the simple moral precept is true that a world in which there is more love is a better place than a world in which there is less, then surely my uncle's world and mine at 6 would have been a better place had we taken up with the points of views of those chickens the way we had taken up with the point of view of the dog that we both mourned. I don't mean to use the term love sentimentally here. I use it in the sense of paying a certain sort of attention. I paraphrase Iris Murdoch when she says, attention is an effort to counteract certain states of illusion. And I think it's an illusion, it's a fantasy to say that the chickens that we slaughtered didn't experience any fear, pain, and couldn't, when we slaughtered them, or couldn't experience joy as they tried to live their lives. It's just true. To love, or as Murdoch put it, to attend respectively, we must bracket certain of our own expectations and prejudices, empathetically imagine and allow ourselves to feel and intelligently discern amongst what we see and feel. Loving is an epistemological notion. Loving is, and I think this is an important point that Murdoch makes, loving is a prerequisite for avoiding loneliness. Loving is a prerequisite for avoiding loneliness. It's a richer sort of world, a world that includes, I think, relations with, loving relations with, attentive relationships to non-humans. It's a world without those relations, or with thin relations, is lonelier. It's lonelier, it seems to me. Another example from this little paper. One evening, this is as an adult, one evening when I was in the field, my grandparents' field, I was surrounded by a group of particularly playful calves. Have you ever played with calves, anybody? Or lambs? Yeah. We had noticed this group previously in the summer, and we jokingly called them the Gang of Five. There were 5 of them. I had seen a version of the game that they were in the process of trying to play with me previously. The calves formed a circle of approximately 100 yards in circumference around me. Each player stands no closer than 7 or 8 yards from the other. A calf walks a few feet forward into the circle, lowers her head toward another calf. The calf lowers her head and walks forward, and then the first calf trots back off into her place in the circle. Various calves that evening began walking toward me, heads slightly lowered. They wanted to play this game with me. It was probably dangerous. I don't know now. I'm stupid, probably, to put yourself in the middle of a little herd of rambunctious 80-pound calves or more. I don't know how much they weighed. Various calves began walking toward me, heads slightly lowered. No calf walked toward me from behind. That was against the rules, I believe. When I lowered my head or walked toward an advancing calf, she ran back to her place in the circle. I was then a player. That's how the game worked. She would lower her head, she'd walk toward you, or she'd trot toward you, and then you lower your head and you walk toward her. And sometimes, the calves will do a little sparring with each other. Sometimes they'll just back off, and they were backing off of me, which is probably a good thing. We did that for about 5-6 minutes. I got to play their game. They played with me. Then I made some inappropriate gesture. I don't know what it was. I turned too fast, perhaps, and the gang galloped away, much like a group of wild ponies. The game lasted for only a minute or two. It's likely that this game was practiced for some ancient skill once necessary to the survival of their ancestors, a skill which these less fortunate animals would never use, or they'd use at the slaughterhouse and lose. Most animal games serve that purpose, including our own, I believe. Maybe I was in some slight danger, I don't know. I do know that I witnessed, among other things, the sheer pleasure that these calves experienced in being so bold as to accost a two-legs me. Their skittishness, like my skittishness in doing so, their sense of giddy humor, they thought it was funny, I'm convinced, and their pride at just having pulled off a good joke and a good game. I spent the first 7 years of my life, 7 years, on a dairy farm, and there you do notice similar things, but it is a different kind of noticing, utilitarian mostly, and usually lacking a crucial depth. So when I'm talking about it lacking this noticing, lacking an empathetic dimension of any depth, I think again I'm talking about a loving dimension of any, not just intellectual but emotional depth. I think loving is about, it's an emotional practice as well as an intellectual one. No, not to get off on that too much. The only other thing that I wanted to read and mention is another favorite quote of mine. Yeah. And all this has to do with this distinction I'm making again between loving and arrogance. This is a quote from John Berger. Have some of you read him? He wrote a great book called On Seeing, I believe was the name of it. And, oh no, it's called About Looking. And this is from his essay called Why Look at Animals. It's a wonderful essay. So the book is about looking, and the essay is Why Look at Animals. John Berger said that the ideology of the post-18th century West maintains that animals are always the observed. Animals are always the observed. The fact that they can observe us has lost all significance. Loving attention meets the animal's gaze. And the recognition of this other presence cannot be underestimated nor fully measured except in terms of the miracle of the feathered, scaled, and furred subjects with whom we have the opportunity, provided we don't abuse it, to make our lives. So the quote here was fairly short. Animals are always the observed, we believe. The fact that they can observe us has lost all significance. But I think that's one thing that we learn when we pay loving attention to them, that they're not only the observed, but they observe us. And that's eerie sometimes. I mean, that's really eerie. I'm sure you've all had this experience with a companion animal, or maybe not. I'm learning this in a really rich and deep and hard way with this horse that I've adopted named Doc. And it's one reason I'm enjoying so much my association with this horse is because it's so challenging to this capacity that I'm calling love or paying moral attention. He's made it very clear to me that he is an observer and a player. And if I don't pay attention to that, I could get hurt, you know. And the fact that he's observing me, the fact that he wants certain things from me, the fact that he will take advantage of my stupidity, and it's just a real. It's relationships are hard, and this is, as they say, and relationships with horses can be especially challenging for those of you who have ever had a relationship with a horse. But it's doing this thing that I've been calling paying loving attention to this horse, that this horse is demanding of me, and that I'm demanding of myself, and that's ultimately going to make possible a workable relationship in which neither of us gets hurt, and in which both of us, I hope, can have fun. And come to care about each other in a deep way. So, and those relationships, I think, are possible with not only dogs, cats, and horses, but with the animals that we eat. And that's one reason I don't eat them. So anyway, well, I've left you about 2 minutes to ask me questions I probably can't answer. So if you have any, please do. Yeah.
I'm assuming your answer may be yes, that as a person for 18 years that's tried not to eat the animals that may biologically be closest to us.
Yeah.
People make the distinction between meat or animals and fowl or fish. Is what you're saying to us across the board there to all kind of fish and seafood at any level, anything that we eat that's in the biological world? And do you see people as moving through stages, like moving away from eating things that they feel closest to, so to speak, and further? Is that common? I mean, I'm struggling there. It seems to me to feel that all of this applies, but I struggle with it. And then about the use of leather.
Yeah.
Shoes, belts, everything.
I know, it's a hard one, yeah.
In terms of the old argument.
I think we ought not to be, I ought not to be, we ought not to be using leather products either. I mean, they're byproducts of the meat industry. That is a hard one, though. It used to be you could buy non-leather products from places like Kmart and Shopko, but now even they're advertising, and touting genuine leather. So but there are some catalogs actually that. Some companies that make non-leather shoes, belts, etc., that look like leather, and you can order from those. The only thing, and I have ordered from those. The only thing, yeah, that I'm leery of from them are hiking boots. If I go into the back country for a week with 40 pounds on my back, I want a really good pair of boots, and I haven't yet found a pair of non-leather hiking boots that work for me. But anyway, and with regard to your first question, it's across the board for me. Singer and Reagan actually say that, or kind of concede that we don't know if like shrimp or clams or some of the other shellfish count, but they argue we should give them the benefit of the doubt, and so that's what I do. But yeah.
So say you have a companion animal who has a debilitating disease, your dog has cancer, that kind of thing. Do you make the dog suffer? Can anticipate, this will make me better at some point. Put it through that little period of hurt and fear and suffering. Or do you just let nature take its course in terms of the compassion and approach? It's more loving to the animal to suffer and to help survive.
I don't think there's an across-the-board answer. When I use the term loving, I'm using the term in like Nussbaum's sense, and I mean paying attention to the individual as well as paying attention to the specifics of the context. So I think it's going to depend on the individual animal, and it's going to depend on the individual context. I had to euthanize a cat of mine a few years ago who was my soulmate. It was, you probably have all been through this too. It's very hard. And I think I probably didn't need to do that, knowing him and knowing the kind of care I was willing to give him. But anyway, some other things happened and I did it. But I sort of agree with Ira Byock, who says that the dying process is part of the living process. I mean, it's an important part of living, and that we should experience our dying as fully as we experience our birthing and living. And I think that's probably true of non-human animals as well, but we still have to gauge it, I think, on a case-by-case basis, and who they are and what we can give them. And so, are we done? Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.